Right here today, I'm joined with my friend Nick Basile, who I've actually got to work with last year at Maven. We hired him for a contract. If you ever went on a Maven landing page and you might see a different theme and color palette, Nick led the design and all of the development for that. Through the process, I kind of realized this dude's legit. He knows his stuff, and I was really excited to learn from him because he has such a unique perspective as someone that can contribute at a really high level in design land, but also as an engineer. So Nick, maybe you could just give us a little bit of background about yourself first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rid. So my name is Nick Basile. I have been a designer and a developer for almost 10 years now, so time is flying. But yeah, exactly. I kind of love to sit in the middle between design and engineering and sort of bridge that gap and go deep when we have design problems, build stuff when we need to get the engineering going. I've lived in startup land almost my entire career, so started out in international education, moved over to advertising, worked at Lambda School for a little bit, both on the instructional side and the product side. Definitely had a lot of fun at Maven when we were working together as well. And now I run Markham Square, which is a digital agency, and we do both product design and development as well.
I don't think there's a better place to start than just getting right into the meatiest of the questions. Nick, I gotta know, do designers need to learn to code?
That is an excellent question, and I'm here to tell you I don't think so. Designers do not have to learn how to code. What I think is much more important is designers need to cultivate a level of technical literacy so that they can have productive conversations with their engineering counterparts. Now, it's not to say I think learning to code is a tremendous investment. I have clearly done it. It has served me well, so I don't want to dissuade anybody from investing the time, but there's a real cost to doing that, both in terms of financial, like taking a boot camp is $10,000+, right? It could be really expensive, both in terms of the pure monetary cost, but also the time cost, the opportunity cost. Anytime you're learning to code, it's time you're not spending learning to perfect and improve your design skills. I think you can get 80% of the benefit of investing in your technical literacy, understanding things like how data works, what is code at, not at a syntax level, but just at a conceptual level, and investing there. And you can find tremendous benefits without having to go through that long, arduous process of actually learning how to program things yourself.
I love the phrase technical literacy. I haven't actually said it like that before, because when I kind of look back on my own journey, I was one of those people that went to the boot camp. So I spent $12,000 learning to code, and I learned a lot, but now I'm about 4 years after the fact, and I'm not an engineer. I still can't write code. I would have to look up everything, which is fine. But what I do have is technical literacy, and 12,000 might seem like an outrageous number, which it is, but I actually consider it worth it because I think the value of just being able to like you said, communicate more effectively and really understand how things are being built and the mental models that engineers are using. It's so valuable. So maybe you could even just talk a bit about that. How do you define technical literacy and why is it so important?
Technical literacy really just means, do you understand how this technology works at a high level, conceptual level? It's having that baseline foundational understanding that you can then leverage in any of your design scenarios.
Amazing. Well, we're not just here to chit chat. You have a little lesson for us and you're actually going to teach us something. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Nick, and then we can kind of just see where this goes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start here with Airbnb, and what we're going to look at here, this is their current live site, and we're going to explore the data needs of this design here in a little bit more detail, and we'll talk through things like components and the other elements of the design and how it relates to code and what sort of level of technical understanding we can glean from this design and how that would sort of work in a sort of technical conversation here. So first off, we have this lovely page here, and they've done a really nice job with their redesign and getting rooms in here.
Yeah, I love that room.
Yeah.
It's so nice.
It's super cool. But when a developer looks at the screen here, what they're looking for patterns, just like we are, right? When we're looking for the boxes on the page, we're looking for the repetition, we're looking for what can be componentized. And so clearly we've got all of these elements here. There's many components inside of here. But the cool thing about these components is that every bit of information in here is data. It's coming from a database somewhere. In Figma, it can be so easy to miss this because we're so used to, okay, we'll just duplicate it, we'll write the text in, and we'll just kind of have this sort of static representation of what this component should be. But in reality, this is all data, right? This is all coming from the database. And so from our perspective, what we can do now is we can share those data concerns with them, and we can start the conversation there instead of saying, hey, you digest this component, you figure out what we need. Instead, we can say, hey, here's the component, here are the data concerns that I've identified, and we can just already leapfrog into a more productive conversation.
Yeah, I love the idea of even just identifying the right right data attributes up front before even getting into Figma. Just kind of having that conversational checkpoint with an engineer and just being like, okay, what data do we have to work with here? Sometimes I'll want to use something and there will be a reason we're like, actually, we're not passing that down. Like we don't actually really have that available for X, Y, and Z reasons. Or it also might be a situation where they'll be like, hey, we also have access to this other table and like it's really easy to get. And I'll be like, oh my gosh, I wouldn't even have thought of using that attribute. And maybe there's a way that I can bring this design more to life. And so I like the idea of aligning on the data that we have available, like really early in the process. I'm kind of wondering if you can help designers think about those early conversations that they're having with an engineer. Like when you're just at the beginning of a project and you're kind of starting to wireframe and think about the core affordances, what are some of the right like questions and specific pieces of terminology that designers can use? Because really we want an engineer to like, man, this person like really gets it. Like they're really thinking about the engineering of this application.
With developers, they're thinking conceptually about three things when it comes to existing coding environments. They're thinking about performance. Like, okay, we've established a baseline level of performance. So how quickly the page is loading, how fast are our queries and things like that. They're also thinking about reliability. They're thinking about like, okay, this works right now. Anything we add to it has the potential to break it. And so we need to maintain our current level of reliability. And that together comes into the concept of sustainability, which is we have to maintain our level of performance and reliability while adding new things to this experience, right? And so when you're talking to a developer, that's what's kind of percolating in the back of their minds is, okay, we're going to have to add all this new stuff, but I'm responsible for maintaining the performance and reliability of the system here. And I need to check everything that the designer is bringing to me against that reality. And so when we're bringing them new designs, we can be really proactive in those conversations. It shows to the developer that you are thinking about the same things that they're thinking about, and it's a great trust exercise. Getting a little more focus on the data needs, whenever we bring a new design to the developers, yes, it's important to say, okay, this is the data and this is what we're expecting, and as much as you can articulate the data considerations, that is going to always be supremely helpful, just to show them that, yes, you've put some thought into the information that's going to be required on the page. And everything is data, images, fonts, graphics, icons, any text you have on the page is data at some level. So what I like to do is I'll get out a spreadsheet, and for example, with this component here, I might say, okay, we're going to have a city attribute, and I'll use some example data. I'll say Los Angeles, and then, okay, we've got a state attribute, that's going to be California. And what you can see there, like I'm writing out California, right? That's a different type of data than like using the acronym, like CA or something like that. And already like those little nuances start getting teased out. So when you go to the developer, and that's a much more productive conversation.
You mentioned spreadsheets. It like brings back a little story where we were designing the original like Maven marketplace with all of the courses, and we kind of had this meeting where our head of engineering told us, hey, this design should have been a spreadsheet. Like we are still at the spreadsheet phase because there are still a lot of data considerations, and like that's the best way to evaluate the path forward right now. And I think about that a lot now where I'm like, should this be a spreadsheet? Like are there still core data decisions that need to be made before getting into Figma? And I think that's a good question that more designers can have in the back of their head.
Sometimes our design tools, we get so comfortable with them. I live and breathe Figma all day. I want to be in Figma. But looking at alternative options that map a little bit better to like the mental models of our peers, like developers, they think in spreadsheets. It's crazy. And so anytime we can leverage a tool that sort of maps to that mental model, I think it's just amazing how much more productive your conversations can be. I totally agree. Start with a spreadsheet and you would be surprised how far your design goes. We can go to our developers and say, what does your seed data look like? Because now all of a sudden we can use the same sort of foundational layer as them. And so that is a really powerful technique that I've not seen a lot of designers pick up on, because again, you need a level of technical literacy to even know that that's possible.
It's something that I'm really excited about actually is the different plugins and add-ons to Figma that are making that possible. And so like I've started using Kernel a little bit more, which is like one of the newer ones. And it's pretty intuitive and it actually allows designers to hook into like the raw JSON that developers are using. I think that's like a really interesting trend that like my hypothesis is we're going to see a lot more of that happening organically in Figma. What are some of the other ways that designers can identify some of the like key technical constraints that they should be considering early on in a project?
An exercise that I like to do is what if scenarios. So this Airbnb example is really wonderful. You can come in here and you might say to yourself, well, what if I have a user and they want to add 20 guests Like maybe it's a family reunion. What if it's a family reunion and they want to add 20 guests? And now all of a sudden I can go and I can hit this incrementer and it caps out at 16. So this team has thought about what is the limit of people that we can have on one reservation. And so you can stretch the considerations of the design and push your design to its absolute limits and say, have I really considered every edge case? Because ultimately that's another big responsibility for developers because they need to consider like, where do these things break? And so anytime we can come to them with constraints and parameters and say, okay, this needs to cap out at 16, they can book a date tomorrow, but nowhere in the past. Like the more we can define those constraints on the design, the faster they're going to be able to implement because they don't have to be sitting there guessing. But we can't think about that unless we do that what if exercise and say, like, what if there's a family reunion trying to get 20 people on the reservation? So that's an exercise that I love to do that pushes the bounds of what's possible and sets up really productive conversations with developers.
I think that's really great and something that I've started to take a little bit more seriously, and even actually having that live outside of Figma I found has been really helpful. Like it's almost more difficult to create this like map of all of the really ugly edge cases and keep track of it in Figma frames. Like it's so much easier to even just have like bullet lists. Like I use a Notion document and it's like, for this project, what are all of the really nasty edge case extreme examples that we think can happen? And then from there you can say, okay, what are we going to account for? Like what's P0, what's P1 in this project? And then you can have that working list and take that into Figma and say like, okay, now I'm going to address these. Another thing that's kind of on my mind, specifically as it relates to the way that data flows, is I'm often asked to think about loading states as a designer. And it's pretty tricky to think about like where those loading states should live based off of like which data is getting loaded in and what the mental models that I should be putting in place are to actually think about how that manifests in design. Do you have any advice for designers that want to be a little bit more strategic in terms of how they think about loading states?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this Airbnb is a great example, right? So if we give this a refresh here, notice how it has those placeholder images over the listings, and then it switches over once the data loads in. And they're doing this for like, they have a very asset heavy design. So there's a ton of images in here. They've got sliders. And I think if you scroll the page, yeah, they're lazy loading in the rest of the data here as well. And they need loading states for that. I think the most productive conversation you can have with your developer about this is ask them, where are requests initiated from? When you render something from the back end, you're essentially pre-fetching the data before it comes to the front end. And so the data should be there, and you don't have as much of a need for a loading state as you would if you were grabbing it from the front end. That's where like a loading state becomes really effective because you have this delay. If you understand my requests are coming from the front end, I'm going to probably need a lot more loading states in my design than if it's coming from the back end. So that's where I would start. The other big question is, where are the graphics coming from? Is this a really graphic intensive design? Because in those cases, images just take a longer time to load, right? They're bigger files, especially if you have a lot of them on the page. And so in those environments, even if you're rendering from the server, you still need to go and get all those images one by one. So anytime images are a big one, and if I have an application that is front end request heavy, I know I'm going to have a lot of loading state. Those are sort of two areas that I don't see commonly brought up that I would start having the conversations around.
Well, Nick, this has been awesome. I think this topic is immensely valuable and one of the best investments that designers can make. I know we've barely scratched the surface, but you are teaching a course specifically on this topic. So maybe you can give us just like a little preview of what people can expect, who's it's for, and what students are going to be able to get out of your course.
Yeah, I'm trying to save you all the bootcamp expense. I'm trying to save you the 10 years of time it took me to go and learn all these things, and instead just get that 80% of benefit that comes from that understanding of technical literacy. So this is a course for designers. It's not for product managers or anybody else on the product team. It is trying to bridge the gap and teach you the things that you've probably picked up on the job, but that nobody has explicitly taught you. So things like, what is an API and how does that even work? What we're doing is we're trying to build your technical literacy. And then once we have that foundation, we can build some mental models of how do developers think about things like reliability, performance, sustainability. And then from there, when we start exploring, okay, what does ideal collaboration look like between designers and developers? Giving you those foundational vocabulary and terminology so you can actually have productive conversations. It's the mental models of how does all this work? What are the pieces? How do they fit together? And then it's that tactical, okay, now that you're collaborating with your developer, here's the best way to go about doing that. So I'm really excited for it and hope to see you all there.